Ms. Kim is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank the committee chair and the ranking members for convening this hearing so we can hear directly from you who have served and experienced during the Afghan withdrawal. And so I want to thank you for being here and enduring these long hours, telling your stories. And this is the beginning of hopefully not only do we do the accountability of what actually happened, but how can we prevent going forward, but at the same time bring some, amplify the stories of what happened so we don't repeat the same mistakes. You guys really stepped up when the administration let so many down, and along the way you saved so many lives. So I want to let you know that your service will never be forgotten, and we will not let your stories go untoward, which is why we're having this hearing. So I want to thank you. The U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan was very difficult for veterans who served to watch. In fact, according to the Department of Veterans Affairs, the calls that were made to the Veterans Hotline really increased about 98%, almost 100%, between August 14 and August 29. So you can see this was very, very difficult time for the veterans. So we owe it to you, the veterans who served in Afghanistan, to get answers to what went wrong during that withdrawal. And I see this hearing as a venue, an avenue to those conversations that we're starting. During that process, we saw Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore sending personnel to assist with the evacuation. So did Japan and South Korea, sending a few aircraft to also assist in that evacuation process. And my office worked very closely with the Canadian government when we couldn't get answers from our government. So I want to know what your coordination was like, if any, with other countries, servicemen and women on the ground. And let me ask specifically Mr. Hong and Mr. Mann, was our State Department helpful in coordinating that, and was it mostly coordinated through other foreign ministries or amongst personnel on the ground?
Thank you, Congresswoman. For our September 17th flight, in order for it to take off, we needed 4 different authorizations. We needed permission from the Taliban to depart Afghanistan. We needed permission to fly into Qatari airspace. We needed permission to land at Al Udeid and prioritization to be, put our personnel there. We had to negotiate all those things without a diplomatic relationship with the new government of Afghanistan, and in a situation that was very, very dynamic. Prior to the departure of the United States from Afghanistan on August 30th, there was a task force in place at the State Department to coordinate all those things, and there was a very clear process. I distinctly remember on the day that we announced that our country's diplomatic and military presence had ended in Afghanistan, that task force ended operations, and we were specifically told that at this point the evacuation was over, that private citizens needed to figure out their own solution, and I was at a loss, as were my co-organizers. Luckily, while the official State Department task force had ended, there were individuals in the State Department who still cared, who stepped up, who tried to figure out solutions for us and other private volunteer groups, despite the lack of clear authorities and clear policies on this. They are also unsung heroes in this, and they were working inside the bureaucracy. But yes, it was very difficult, Congresswoman, to figure out how to get a plane off the ground in a country where we no longer had a presence.
That's really speaking volumes that members of Congress and our veterans and the evacuation support system, they had to rely on other nations to help our citizens and allies in a time of need. If you can add to that, please.
I'll just build on that. I think that there were outstanding individuals that went above and beyond the call within the State Department to help us get folks in. But what I will say is that overall, it was very, very difficult to coordinate with the State Department during the evacuation. I think we got better. And I think the private-public partnership that was displayed by these volunteer groups with the government and the State Department is probably precedent-setting. And I don't think it's going away. Future crises like this, we're going to continue to see it. So we need to figure it out. And then the other thing that I would just say is that I think that the private groups came up with a lot of solutions, proposed solutions that were very viable with potential third countries and places to go, lily pads. And it seemed to me that they were dismissed out of hand as these weren't viable groups or viable organizations. But yet they were the very people that were turned to whenever someone needed to get out in dire straits. And so I think listening to these private groups more and putting their solutions into play, because they have a lot of really good ideas on third countries and other options. And I think the State Department listening to them more and opening the aperture more for that dialogue is critical.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
Gentlewoman yields back. Mr. Crow is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you. I want to reiterate what I said a little while ago about your heartfelt testimony, which I have found to be compelling with all of you, candid, honest, and incredibly insightful. And I appreciate your service then and now going forward so we can have this discussion. There's been a lot of talk about this being America's longest war. This is not just an August of 2021 issue, although it is absolutely worth diving deep into August of 2021. But over 2,400 Americans gave their lives during this war. Countless Afghans gave their lives. 2 decades, 4 administrations, 10 Congresses. A lot of talk about a moral failure, and there have been several moral failures that have occurred. One of them has happened within the United States Congress, because it is the U.S. Congress that has the authority and the obligation to decide matters of war and peace, and to force conversations, tough conversations, about these issues, about SIV programs, about refugee programs, about authorizations for use of military force. And we have abdicated time and time and time again. To this day, we have abdicated that authority. And it's time to take it back, to force that conversation, because we owe it to you. We owe it to all of our veterans to do so. A couple of facts remain, though. Number one, there was no status quo. This notion that there was a status quo in August of 2021 that could have continued is not true. President Biden inherited a deal that was signed by President Trump, and at the end of that deal, when it came time for our troops to leave, the Taliban were going to launch a massive all-out assault on U.S. forces. We had 2,000 troops in country at that time, and they couldn't have defended themselves, and they couldn't have defended the Afghans. So we would have had to have plussed up to 15,000, 20,000, 25,000, pick a number. It would have been a massive surge, and we'd be fighting and dying to this day. And I don't believe that we should have done that. The last is the evacuation. The problems, the challenges, the missteps with the evacuation have been well documented. You have helped illustrate those further. I agree with you. We have to be honest about that. My criticisms of the administration have been well documented. And we have to be honest about that challenge so we make sure it never happens again. I want to make sure, though, when we're having that discussion, that we are clear on the civil servants, those in the State Department, those in the Defense Department, that poured their hearts and souls also into this to protect the people that they fought with and served with. I have had countless conversations where those civil servants, those men and women, have broken down into tears because they too lost friends and left friends behind. And I think we have to acknowledge that a lot of people within this administration and going forward have done that work. So with that in mind, Ms. Mackler, I'd like to turn to you. We've talked a lot about the SIV program. I've done a lot of work on that program, as have many of you. But I want to talk a little bit more in the time that we have left on the non-SIV elements that we have to address. All of those civil society leaders, judges, girls, women, journalists, others who are fighting to get out, who can't do so under the SIV program. But we need to expand the P1, P2, other programs. What do we need to do? And how do we get those folks prioritized?
Thank you, Congressman. That is such a great question. The P1, P2 programs are refugee resettlement programs. They require an individual to have worked for a U.S. Military contractor, NGO, or media organization, and to be referred into that program by those individuals. So we've been getting a lot of questions recently about that, about the new sponsor circles and refugee sponsor circles that were recently announced by the Department of State. None of that will help. Really, quite frankly. And the individuals that you're talking about, the civil servants, the lawyers, the judges, the everybody else in civil society who built up Afghanistan, modeled on the promise that we made them of the Afghanistan that we promised them, they have, quite frankly, no options. And sometimes we've been able to, for those who have who have education, we've been able to get fellowships, using visas for internships, all very temporary solutions. All very visas for performers, visas for scientists, things like that. But the options are just, frankly, very, 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 very limited.
Do we need a new category of visa to address these folks?
We need a new category of visas to have our immigration policies and laws reflect the labor needs that this country has right now and the economic needs that this has right now. I mean, this goes to the agricultural sector, the industrial sector, as much as the more highly educated sectors and fields. I mean, right now you can come and study in our universities and then not stay because there are no visa options for you, even though you've been educated here. And so across the board, we need more pathways, more generous pathways. And then in addition to that, we need to clear the backlogs. There are a lot of folks who would be able to bring family members, who would be able to bring others, who are choosing not to come because they would have to leave family behind. And a lot of that is just sort of caught up in the backlog. So I would start there. And I would also just say, I know we're out of time, but I would also say, things that don't require legislative fixes, but just put in more resources into these agencies that are chronically underfunded so that we can get through the applications. Right now, it takes a year to get a work permit.
Gentleman yields back. I ask unanimous consent the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing without objective, so ordered. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. First, let me join with my colleagues today. It's been a long day, and thank each of you for your testimony before the committee in a forthright way. It's all appreciated, and you can tell that on both sides of the aisle how meaningful your personal testimonies about the tragedies in August of 21 were. And to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who are making sure that this is a bipartisan catastrophe, I believe that there have been mistakes made for 22 years in a variety of ways as it relates to any war we fight, particularly the war fought in Afghanistan. But let's be clear. If we knew we were leaving at the beginning of the Biden administration, based on the Trump administration, then where was the plan? Where was the plan to properly evacuate? And as my friend Mr. Crow knows, we had two briefings, one in April of 21 and one in July of 21 or June of 21, in the House of Representatives, classified briefings, bipartisan. And the veterans who fought in Afghanistan were the most skeptical of what we were listening to in the spring of 21 and early summer of 21, briefed by the IC, the intelligence community, and the military about the plan, because there was no evidence of a plan. So we may well not have had a choice but to leave, but how you leave is a choice. And it could have been done, in my view, in an extraordinarily more effective manner. And it was a failure not of intelligence, but of political and leadership failure, in my view. And I agree with the witness that have suggested that that this led and contributed to Putin's calculus about what would come next. Since it is International Women's Day, let me start with my trip to Kabul in 2015, when I witnessed firsthand Afghanistan's steps in a positive way, then for social progress with the help of the United States and without the brutal control of the Taliban. On that trip, I met a young woman, Naeed Azhar, who was from Jalalabad, and I took tea with her that afternoon, and she was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Arkansas, earning a master's degree in anthropology, and she wanted to be home in Afghanistan with her career as an independent researcher and writer. And Before what happened in 21, that just reminded me of what a future of a free Afghanistan might have looked like. And we abandoned our allies and our innocent civilians like Naeed to the Taliban. Colonel Mann, thanks for your testimony, and especially your focus on Afghan women. And I've seen firsthand that positive force that they were playing in Afghan civil society before our withdrawal. How much process on the status of women has been undone under the Taliban regime?
Thank you, Congressman. I feel pretty underqualified to address this in the sense that I believe, hopefully, where this will go. I mean, I'm going to try to address it, but I think in the future, hopefully, we'll have a range of women leaders on the panels as well addressing this. Hopefully, from Afghanistan as well, because I think there's so much that we need to dig into on this. What I can tell you is what I'm hearing from leaders of the group sitting behind me right now that are very engaged with at-risk Afghans in country, and of course people that we've worked with in Task Force Pineapple. And what we have done is to literally wind the clock back to a pre-9/11 draconian civil society in Afghanistan, where women and girls are relegated to not much more than property, if that. And the atrocities that are occurring at a humanitarian level right now against women and girls are unconscionable. And I can tell you, in interviewing Minister Hasina Safi, the Minister of Women's Affairs, when we were talking about that day when everything fell apart, I'll paraphrase what she said was, everyone in the West for years has talked about advancing women's rights in the world and advancing women's rights in Afghanistan, but on the day we needed it most, it was nowhere to be found.
Thank you. And I agree completely. And I hope we do have a panel as we explore the wrongs of this evacuation process, women. I appreciate your testimony. I'm proud to be with you. I want to thank all the groups that worked doing the job that the State Department should have done. We still have cases in my office unresolved. And when I visited Quantico to meet SIVs, 6,000 people at Quantico, there were less than 100 that were SIVs. And we did not take care of the SIVs in this process. And I yield back. Now recognize my friend Mr. Barrow for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, I want to recognize Sergeant Vargas Andrews. You're from Folsom, California. I had the privilege of representing Folsom in a prior Congress. I also want to recognize all the veterans here, but their family members and everyone who's served over the years for your service. When I meet a veteran, I don't know if they're a Democrat or a Republican, and when they serve, they're just meeting the task that's in front of them, the mission that they've been given. So thank you and be proud of that. I'm glad that my colleague, Representative Green, talked about that. You should be proud of your service. We're proud of your service. So for all the veterans, the men and women that served and their families, thank you for that, and we're proud of you. But Lieutenant Colonel Mann, you did talk about the healing process and what we need to do in the pain. And we certainly saw it with Vietnam veterans who returned and suffered in silence for years. Let's learn from that. Let's try to start the healing process. And we've touched on a couple things that we could actually do. We can't rewrite the past, but we can, by understanding the past, understanding mistakes, learning from those mistakes, we should do that oversight. And I think we all agree upon that. We should not abandon the Afghans that helped us, that supported us, their family members. I'm proud to represent Sacramento County, which I think is the largest, has the largest population of Afghan refugees. I know my staff in those days in August and September, submitted over 10,000 names for humanitarian parole. The calls that they were getting, were heartbreaking. And I know all of our staffs were going through a lot of those calls, along with many of the veterans. We should honor that. We've touched on the Afghan Adjustment Act. Ms. Mackler, let me ask you a question. If we don't pass that act by August, what's going to happen?
Tens of thousands of Afghans who are evacuated will remain in limbo at risk of deportation, unable to begin their lives, unable to move past this moment and keep going towards safety and protection.
So to my Republican colleagues, to my Democratic colleagues, that is a tangible thing that we can do. We can pass the Afghan Adjustment Act. We can, certainly protect the folks that are here. State Department was overwhelmed. I'm glad that some on the panel have talked about the individual members who stepped up and went beyond their call of duty. Let's fix this problem. Let's continue to get folks out of Afghanistan, family members, women, and others that are at risk to the best of our ability. We can do that. Lieutenant Colonel, you touched on the moral injury, and we certainly have to think about what that looks like, understand it, and then think about what we need to do to heal that moral injury. Do you have some thoughts on how we should approach that?
The one thing that I haven't covered yet is we did one of the guys in Pineapple did an interview with a gentleman named George who lives in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And George has been very, very active. He's as a former Green Beret in evacuating partners into North Carolina and settling onto farmland that he's helped them acquire. The interesting thing about George as a Green Beret is the indigenous partners that he's evacuating are Montagnards. He's a Vietnam-era Green Beret who has been evacuating Montagnards for decades. And his nonprofit has been doing this very, very successfully. And when asked, George, how long are you going to do this? And he said, until I'm dead. And I think the point that this goes back to one of the comments that was made earlier, I believe it was by Congresswoman Titus, about why weren't we, talking to the Trump administration and previous administrations about what was going on. The reality is we were living our lives. We were running our businesses. We were running our nonprofits. We were raising our kids. We had run the miles as veterans and had completed our times of service. And we were drawn back into this, not of our own volition, but by a set of circumstances that we could not stand for, that we couldn't, people ask me why I got involved with this. I said, because my 3 boys are watching me right now. And, so my point is, this is going to continue to go. And what we've got to do is to find a way to responsibly relieve the veterans of this burden, or the moral injury recovery is going to be very difficult.
Well, and that's something that we have in our power, that we should do and undertake as bipartisan members of Congress, to think about how we can work with the State Department administration to address that and relieve you of some of that burden, but to get the mission done, as you did. Thank you. And I'll yield.